just watched a great stay-at-home that you did for Jacobin. So you guys have been doing this stay-at-home series since the beginning of the pandemic, where usually you'll be hosting. Sometimes other people will have subbed for you a couple times. And there will be some left-wing thinker who will come in there and give a presentation for about half an hour, and then you'll ask them some questions. But this time you did it yourself, so you weren't limited to the half an hour. And
I teased our book, the book that me, you, and Mike Beggs are working on, and people will hear a lot more about in the next year as we kind of get further along in the process. But a book laying out a vision of a feasible socialism, which should be out somewhere spring 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited about that. And I guess thinking about feasible socialism, you know, the talk that you gave for the stay at home was about social democracy and how we should think about social democracy. And if you think, all right, so social democracy is, you know, at least it's a word that's meant a lot of things, you know, to different people at different times, but the way we usually use it now, right, you know, we're talking about, you know, movements, efforts, you know, by leftists and socialists to reform capitalism by doing things like instituting social programs to you know, to provide for social rights like healthcare and housing, and of course that's what I was talking about with Harvey. But you know, but you mentioned the feasible socialism book, right? So you know, this is a book that we're writing, you, me, and Mike Beggs, about how we could get beyond capitalism entirely, right? You know, without just sort of doing the thing that the left sometimes falls into doing, where we sort of treat socialism as this word that stands for some destination politically where we've achieved all the good things and gotten rid of all the bad things, but actually thinking about a realistic society that could actually exist without, you know, without having to have society divided into workers and capitalists at all, right?
Right.
And so I think a reasonable question that somebody might have, right, listed to this is, well, hold on. So why are you guys so excited about social democracy if you think that it's possible to get past capitalism entirely, that we could have a society where workers own their own enterprises, and we didn't have this separate class of owners at all? Then hey, you know, what's all this interest in messing with and, you know, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic of capitalism, right? You know, why are we so interested in the social democratic reformism? And I know it's a big topic, but I was hoping you could just speak a little bit to how those two goals relate to each other, you know, reforms within the existing system and trying to get past it entirely.
Well, I think for starters, it's worth saying that when we talk about social democracy, we're not just talking about stuff the government does or any system that has a lot of state intervention. Like we wouldn't call, for example, the French system under de Gaulle or the forms of planning that were utilized in Taiwan and South Korea and other countries that actually played a useful role stimulating growth, but certainly weren't egalitarian in their intent. We wouldn't call that social democracy. So in particular, when we talk about the social democratic project, we're talking about projects that were led by workers' parties with roots in the working class, that had initially at their core the impetus of class struggle in the early years. Then by the end, by the time the contradictions of social democracy, you could say, reached their peak in the 1970s, also had a rash of working class upsurge. So the bottom line is that it's the experience of working class governance and working class political movements, both in state power and also kind of the extra parliamentary parts like trade unions and trade confederations and affiliated social movements outside of power connected to them within the political economy of capitalism. So still obviously within the constraints of capitalism, but attempting to administer some change within it. So in the same way that as socialists, we should be interested in Chavez's Venezuela or what's happened in Bolivia and in other countries that have attempted to bring about, at the very least, reform programs from below with progressive social bases, we should be interested in these attempts as well in the global north. And if you can't win the class power to achieve something like Medicare for all in the United States, or achieve the rudiments of a social democratic program as far as a jobs guarantee and the rest, then how are you going to get the class power to put on the agenda demands for worker self-determination, worker ownership of the means of production in the workplace? So it seems to me that the two are absolutely integrally connected, though part of understanding the contradictions and limits of social democracy is thinking about how these reformist parties of social democracy had their limits weren't great, not because they administered reforms, but because their political practice and their structures couldn't take them beyond those reforms. They would open the door to more radical questions, but they would not be able to answer them fully. So we should clarify what our criticism from the left is. It isn't against these important kind of building back blocks to, kind of building state, some sort of left workers' power. In the United States, obviously, we are so far from the limits of social democracy. We are so far from achieving anything. The left really needs to tally victories to tell people that, if you support left candidates, you aren't just registering a protest. It's connected to real material differences in your lives.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Just I guess to make the conversation less classy, I often think of the scene in Kill Bill where Uma Thurman is escaping from the hospital, and she's still sort of paralyzed, and she's just trying to get herself to wiggle her big toe, so she can eventually start walking and get in the car and go off to slaughter her enemies. And I think there's something, there's something there, right? That like that just achieving Canadian style healthcare in the United States, which it's absurd to talk about that as just in the sense that we're all living through this grisly real world advertisement for the importance of universal healthcare, but it's also like just achieving that is going to take monumental political struggle. We just saw the DNC platform committee vote down Medicare for all, like 125 to 36, which is amazing because it's a party platform. It's like a wish list for the party faithful that that like almost nobody else actually reads. Being like the safest, most like symbolic way to concede the point, but they're not willing to do it even there, which shows you how much of an uphill climb we've got on there. But certainly, I think if we can start to achieve some things that really make a difference to people, and by the way, should also say that like certainly in the kind of socialism that we want, that we think is realistic, and and we could imagine happening in the near future, in our lifetimes, right? It's like peace in our time, socialism in our time. That we, having worker ownership of firms would be fantastic. It would be amazing. It would be the first time we didn't have society divided between a ruling class and a subordinate class since the agricultural revolution. But it wouldn't mitigate the need for things like a national health service.
Right, exactly. So some of these decommodifications are things we are taking, the meaning of decommodification, right? We're taking it from the market. We're making sure that people can enjoy the social rights. But what would the health system look like in a place like the United Kingdom under full socialism, quote unquote? Well, it would probably look a lot like the NHS, right? Or at least the way the NHS used to be in its peak in the 70s, before they added additional user fees and things like that. So, yeah, I think it's just very straightforward why we should care about these things. And also, I'm in general very comfortable with the fact that political leaders like AOC and Bernie and a host of people who support them call themselves democratic socialists. So their aspirations are, in many ways, social democratic, in that, at least when it comes to AOC, at no point in her life has she talked about really worker ownership of the means of production and so on. You know, Bernie, for large chunks of his life, openly advocated for some sort of socialization there. And I think if you probably catch him in private, he might not back down. He might say, okay, well, it can't be old school nationalization. Maybe it has to be this or that form. But he probably just thinks it's not feasible. I don't think he's really repented from any of his prior positions. But, you know, the left is so weak in this country. Socialism, I think, has a bigger danger of falling back into the ghetto of just extreme sectarian self-isolation. And that's a bigger danger than having socialism be so extremely ill-defined that it means any advocation of decommodification. So I'd rather, in other words, have a broad movement that calls itself socialist, that fights day to day for social democratic reforms, and then to that movement make the argument that we need to go beyond social democracy. I think that's a great starting point for us to be on the left. But obviously, with socialism, we don't just mean what a lot of Bernie-crats do when they say they're socialists and they support small business and they believe in a mix of, you know, capitalism and socialism. That's why they're democratic socialism. I think that's a common sense of, you know, several million Bernie-crats in this country, and we have to work from that common sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Liza Featherstone, Jacobin columnist, could be coming on in about 10 minutes. Maybe still does do this advice column for the Nation, where there was one that I loved from like back in 2016, where the person who was writing in was like, "Hey, my friend, you know, calls himself a socialist, but he listens to all these he watches all these lame commentators on MSNBC, and you know, and he doesn't really understand what it means, and you know, how do I break it to him, right, that he's not a real socialist?" And her answer was basically that socialism, I think these were her words, isn't like your favorite indie band that's like not cool anymore because too many people like it, right? You know, that that we're not going to be able to achieve any of our political goals unless this breaks through to a much bigger category of people. And it was an advice column answer. It didn't go on for that long, but like I think you could expand the point in ways you're just suggesting by saying, look, which is more productive, right? Standing off in a corner somewhere saying, "Hey, we're real socialists," right? Not like you pretenders, you know. So like, don't you go, be calling yourself that, or saying, "Hey, welcome, comrades. When we use this term, we mean some stuff that maybe goes beyond what you mean, but we also see you as political allies, and we want to like fight together for all the stuff that we do both agree on." And actually, even on the AOC point, by the way, I think that's mostly true, although there have been a couple of interesting instances in which she has gestured in the direction of something that actually does deal with questions about the workplace and ownership. Most notably on Martin Luther King Day this year, she was doing a discussion with Ta-Nehisi Coates, where they started talking about Jeff Bezos's charitable giving. And she said, "Hey, I don't, we don't want Bezos's money," or presumably what she meant is we don't just want Bezos's money. Bezos's money would be a nice start. We want his power. If he really wants to be a good person, he should turn Amazon into a worker co-op, which, whatever you think about the limitations of AOC's politics or the ways that she's imperfect, that's not a sentence I would have expected to hear from a sitting congresswoman probably in my lifetime if you told me that a couple years earlier.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that we have a great starting point compared to where we were 5 years ago. But fundamentally, as socialists, we should acknowledge the division between socialism today as a largely intellectual current and a subcultural current in American political life. Before it wasn't even that, right? We were run out of academia, and we weren't even large enough to be a subculture. We were a subculture. We weren't like the Harry Potter fan club. We were like the people who like went out to play Quidditch on broomsticks or something. I don't know. But there's that division that's emerged between socialism as an intellectual current and social movements and the workers' movement. as it
Mm.
exists, right? And our job as socialists is to get to the point where we can merge together, fuse together those currents so we can speak of them as one and the same. And when you think about the history of especially early European social democracy, the early social democratic parties, it was that combined workers' movement. When you think about what certain national liberation movements have become, it was a fusing together of all those elements. When you think about what MAS and these other parties, MAS in Bolivia and these other parties were, it's a fusing together of trade union and social movement and the political socialist currents together into a mass formation. And part of the problem today is that we need to both be confident in our mission, confident in what we're doing, but also aware of how weak we are. And it's a difficult thing to combine, but if you're not aware of how weak you are, then you might be able to pretend, oh, look around me, there's plenty of workers here. Half the people in my
Yeah.
DSA chapter are wage workers who have part-time jobs and feel all these sorts of other things. The depiction of DSA as largely middle class people is wrong, right? You could say things like that, and you might be right in the micro instances, but you're missing a wider truth, a wider point, which is that the left in the U.S. is isolated from a mass base, and we need to try to go out there and get one. And I'm less afraid of mistakes in the direction of a vulgarization of our ideas or mistakes in the direction of a mainstreaming of our ideas, as long as it doesn't mean, to use very old left language, very obscure left language, class collaboration. As long as it doesn't mean sitting down at the table with Jeff Bezos and figuring out some sort of corporate scheme to, do this, that, or what, then I'm very comfortable with what AOC is doing, what Bernie is doing, what a lot of other figures associated with DSA are doing. And we just have to keep pressing forward in this environment. We can't go back to even 2015. Even the environment before Bernie, where you had the return of protests, but it wasn't crystallized around a clear and coherent demand to win majoritarian support. And that's what we constantly have to search for when it comes to everything we're fighting for. Obviously not just things in the workplace and Medicare, but fights against oppression of all kinds. These just need to be tied to concrete material demands.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to something I was talking about with Harvey, right? I mean, that kind of genius of that civil rights movement slogan about jobs and freedom. March on Washington for jobs and freedom. It ties together the particularity of demand for full civic and legal equality for everybody, right? Across all identity categories, with an economic agenda that is maybe going to disproportionately benefit the people who've been the greatest victims of the current system, but is also just going to benefit most people as a general rule, which which just seems like it's not a big like Marxist insight or anything, but but does seem to be true that that if you can appeal to the perceived material interests of the majority of the population, you're a lot more likely to win. I do want to just pivot for a minute to, since we kind of referred to it earlier, but I don't know if people really get a good sense from that of what winning might look like. Now, obviously, like we just said, even achieving Canadian style Medicare for all in the United States is going to be an epic struggle. The idea that okay, maybe if we eventually push social democracy to its limits, we get a situation where you either have to retreat from what's already been achieved or you have to go beyond capitalism entirely. But of course, in the US context, if you're living in the real world, we are hilariously and tragically far from being at that crossroads, right? Like the limits of social democracy are nowhere in sight. But if we imagine a situation where they were, where like for example, something you talk about in your talk, right? Was the most advanced Nordic social democracies at the point where there were starting to be schemes proposed to do things that would go beyond capitalism entirely. Hi, Liza. And then you think, okay, well, what would actually taking the route not taken look like, right? That like if you think about, all right, we know what retreat from what's already been achieved looks like, because sadly we've seen that all over the place, right? That's a very familiar story.
I think the route not taken would be a route that brings in questions of power and ownership sooner. In other words, what the Swedes and other forms of social democracy settle for is what they described as a functional socialism. So they achieved actually a huge measure an egalitarian distribution of wealth. But an egalitarian distribution of wealth isn't the same thing as an egalitarian distribution of power. There was a time in the 50s and 60s when that distinction seemed purely ideological. But what in fact happened was the inegalitarian distribution of power led to a rollback of the distribution of wealth. So if you want a sustainable social democracy, you have to push towards democratic socialism, because you have to push towards a condition where you don't have a class of people who have a vested interest in rolling back the rights of labor. And you don't have this contradiction, to use very old kind of Marxist language, between the class of owners and the class of laborers. And in many ways, giving workers power over production is a way of resolving that tension and that antagonism in society. Of course, there'll still be other politicized antagonisms. There'll still be maybe the tension between a region that's very wealthy and a region that needs to have some transfers of wealth to that region. There'll still be contradictions between town and country. There'll still be contradictions between worker owners in different sectors of various levels of profitability that are taxed at different rates and whatnot. But those are political problems that can be resolved in the framework of the state, of bargaining, of any sorts of other ways, but they're not as ingrained as the tensions that arose in these countries between a small group of capitalists that felt their profits being squeezed, a group of workers who felt like they deserved more rights from vis-a-vis kind of their bosses, but also from the society as a whole, public sector workers and private sector workers, all these tensions. So all this led to the unraveling of a lot of the social democratic arrangement. I think we have to be careful and not state that it's all been undone. A huge portion of the wealth of these countries are still going towards social ends. They're still funding pension and healthcare and education at a far greater extent than it is even in a place like the United States and other advanced capitalist countries that didn't have the experience of social democracy. But I think that's a key thing. Think about questions of power and ownership early, rather than just as a culmination. So we don't want to rerun social democracy and just sit in power from 1930 to 1970 before we even begin to propose more radical distributions of power.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That we do want to learn from the mistakes of past social democratic movements, but we also do need to start with social democracy, right? You can't walk without crawling, and all the cliched metaphors there.
Yes, but it needs to be a form of social democracy rooted in class struggle, rooted in the same thing that gets you those more radical things. It can't be Gaullism or a form of kind of statist intervention, because I think in our lifetime we will see real Trumpism. So Trump himself wasn't a believer, let's say, in what Bannon believed in and what some parts of his coalition believed in, and we'd be in a much more scary place if we had a racist, xenophobic leadership that was actually willing to deficit finance and willing to give jobs and buy off segments of the working class that way. Luckily, Trump is really just a bastard in every sense. He has very little concern even for his some of his alleged constituents. So we dodged a bullet there. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess I just also say that, for anybody who until the spring of 2022 or, whenever the Feasible Socialism book comes out, wants to get a little bit of a sense of what some of the best developed ideas about what, the running part of the first you crawl, then you walk, then you run, might actually look like, and what a left agenda that actually did something about these questions of workplace autonomy, of power structurally within the economy looked like. Your book, your earlier book, the Socialist Manifesto, the first chapter is very good on that, and also as a longtime resident of New Jersey in the past. I really appreciate that the fictional class struggle social democratic movement in the first chapter of that book is called Bon Joviism. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, but it's Springsteenism. That's a social democracy. You know, Bon Jovi is false consciousness. I think everybody knows Springsteen is the true ruler of New Jersey. You know, it's I guess which one's Turnpike and which one's Parkway. Anyway, that's for another discussion. I'm sure Liza actually probably has an opinion on that in particular, but I should let you two get to it, and maybe even having Liza on the screen reminds me that we should actually probably do a nice Jacobin YouTube panel at some point with us three and maybe another good interlocutor.
Oh, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming on, brother. Really
All right,
appreciate
take
it.
care. Yeah, appreciate it. Best
Good
of luck.
to see you, Bhaskar.
All right, bye.